We are massively over-regulated. It's crushing the spirit of entrepreneurialism and innovation and all that California represents. From small businesses, I hear all the time, it's just such a hassle and a struggle to do anything.
It feels like you're guilty until proven innocent if you're an employer here right now.
We're now in the 23rd year of Gavin Newsom's 10-year plan to end homelessness in San Francisco. $700,000, $800,000, $1 million now in San Francisco per unit. So often in government, you've got to follow the money. People who are doing the wrong thing actually get rewarded. I was born in the UK. Both my parents were Hungarian, left communism as refugees. I supported Brexit and Donald Trump. I was the first to call out the lockdowns. There's something about California that to me is very, very special.
You're not leaving, you're staying here and fighting.
Here we are, running for governor.
CEO and co-founder. The founding partner of Palantir co-founder Joe Lonsdale.
We talk a lot about how broken California is. My friend Steve Hilton is trying to fix it. He's running for governor. Steve helps run the British government in the UK, came over here to California, became one of the top hosts on Fox News, millions of followers there, but he got tired of just talking about what was broken. He wanted to be a leader again. Now Steve's running for governor. He has a lot of opinions on policy. He has a lot of people excited about what he's doing. Let's hear from Steve. Really excited to have Steve Hilton here with us today, candidate for governor for California officially now.
Exactly.
You were a former Fox News host. I think most people know you from TV. You also helped advise David Cameron in the UK. You know, a lot of people know you from TV, but not everyone knows your parents actually fled communism in Hungary to go to England, right?
Yeah, so I was born in the UK, in England, London, but both my parents are Hungarian, left communism as refugees, ended up in England. My stepfather's also Hungarian, so the whole family is Hungarian. And really, we grew up in England, a very classic kind of immigrant, kind of working class lifestyle, you know, that kind of trying to climb the ladder of opportunity. I very much kind of think of that when I look at what's going on for people in California. But that background, the more I think about my background and my parents and Hungary and all of that, the more formative it's been to me over the years, it seems.
So you studied at Oxford, which means you climbed up to the British elite there, and you worked in UK politics. What sparked your interest to come out to the United States and into Silicon Valley?
Yeah, it was interesting. Exactly as you say. I wrote about that in a book about 10 years ago, More Human. And I was really at the beginning of, you know, I supported Brexit and Donald Trump and all of that, at the beginning of that populist uprising, the revolution that's really sort of playing out now in so many different ways. And whilst railing against the elite and the establishment, acknowledged that, of course, you know, I was going to Oxford University and working in 10 Downing Street. It kind of makes you part of that. But the way I always put it is I never forget where I came from. And that's been a really important part of the story. In terms of California, we moved here in 2012. I was working in Downing Street at the time. I was senior advisor to the Prime Minister. I was mainly focused on our kind of domestic policy plans and trying to help implement them after working for many years, kind of developing those ideas and developing the plans. I was in 10 Downing Street for a couple of years. He became Prime Minister in 2010. It was a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats. I shared an office in 10 Downing Street with my opposite number from another party, and we were trying to work together to make stuff happen. But at the same time, my wife was working at Google. She had a big job at Google. I always say she has the real serious career in our family. And she was global head of communications and public policy and all of that for Google. And so she was doing her global job from London because of my work in 10 Downing Street. And when our second son was born, around about that time, you know, there's a lot of travel for her and the time difference. And we were just thinking about it from a family point of view. Let's see what it would be like just to move to California for a bit, for her to be closer to her place of work. So it wasn't really at that time, we didn't really think this is it. We're moving to California for good. But I remember very clearly a moment when I felt that, actually. It was 2016. So we'd been here 4 years. You know, I'd done a bunch of things. I was teaching at Stanford, and I started a company and did various things here in California, but went back in 2016. I wrote a book, came out in 2015, went back to get involved in the Brexit campaign. in 2016. And I remember coming back from that, landing at San Francisco airport, and just looking out of the window as the plane was taxiing in, thinking, it's so great to be home. And I suddenly thought, oh, that's interesting. Home. This is how I think of California now. And really, that was the moment I realized I not just literally our home, where we're raising our family and starting a company and all those things, but in a deep way, I feel at home in California. I think of California as the place that kind of captures everything that I admire in the world and everything that I want to be involved in. Of course, as we'll discuss, it's gone way off track in my view, but I really love California. And that was the moment that it really crystallized for me. And that really began a process of saying, okay, well, if this is our home, let's put down roots here properly.
And you got your citizenship after that.
Became a citizen in 2021 after going through the process. And here we are, running for governor.
And I want to ask about that, but I want to talk a little bit about politics and media first, because you've had a lot of experience in both. First of all, politics. What did you learn working with Cameron, and what did you learn from the whole Brexit thing? Because I was actually a cautious supporter of Brexit from the perspective of Brussels has lost their mind, and there's these crazy human rights courts and these things, but then you didn't even get out of the courts anyway, and then they kind of screwed it up. What happened with this?
Yeah, well, so those two things really interact actually, because I remember very clearly in the work that I was doing in 10 Downing Street, trying to help implement the program that we'd been elected on, and then that we'd negotiated with our coalition partners. There was a coalition agreement that was written down. Here are the policies that we are the elected government trying to do, trying to make happen. And that daily grind of trying to work that through the bureaucracy was really something that obviously we'd been told about, and I personally hadn't had experience inside of government until that point.
So you're actually running a government, you're the governor of the UK, you're elected to do it, and you can't do the things you want to do because of Europe.
Not just that, but not just Europe, but also the bureaucracy. And there's many lessons from that I think of all the time in relation to the task ahead in California in terms of really taking on the bureaucracy and the over-regulation and so on. But specifically on the role of the EU, it wasn't just that they were making it more difficult to do what we wanted to do. They were making us do things that we didn't want to do. And in fact, there was a moment pretty early on when I remember talking to the Prime Minister, and we'd heard something on the BBC radio news that morning, and it was some government announcement. And I didn't know about it, and I asked him, said, did you know about this? And what? He said, no. And we didn't even, not just that we didn't know about it, we didn't agree with it.
Wow.
So, well, wait, how come the government is doing something that the Prime Minister didn't know about and doesn't agree with? So that set me off on a path of trying to understand the actual process through which things happen in a government. And the visible stuff is legislation that goes through Parliament in the case of the UK. Here it would be the Congress. But most of what happens that actually ends up affecting people and families and businesses.
It's the agencies.
The agencies, the bureaucracy, the grinding machinery of government. So that's what I started to really investigate, the details of the process. And if you give me a minute to lay it out, I think it's highly relevant, because this is what we need to understand in order to make change happen here. There will be some equivalent here in California.
There's a lot of powerful agencies here in California.
And the way that it works, so in the UK setting, the way it worked was, back in the day, most of the business of government, like approving things that the bureaucracy, the administrative state would do, went through cabinet committees. It's cabinet government. You've got a parliamentary system, members of the cabinet, and they're very powerful, and they run their departments. But it's collective decision making, and it used to be in cabinet committees. So they would meet in a committee and discuss a policy or a proposal or some rule that they wanted to do, and they'd vote on it, and then it would be implemented or not. As the EU took over more and more functions, it ended up being the case that cabinet ministers had to spend more time physically in Brussels attending EU meetings. That meant that they weren't physically present in London to attend cabinet meetings so often. So a process was already there, but it was expanded, called requests for policy approval. And this was basically the jargon for it was a write round, because if a government department or a minister or whatever wanted to do something, they would write a letter, literally a piece of paper with attachments to the other members of the committee.
Yeah.
And that would be the process for getting approval, request for policy approval. That massively expanded to take over almost all of how policy was made. And so I asked to see all of the requests for policy approval over a certain period. I actually took this and showed it to my Stanford class when I was teaching here. There's a pile of paper like this, like about a foot high. And that was not even 1 week. That was 4 days. Wow. 4 days of the UK. Now, there were attachments and but that was a huge amount of people.
How does anyone keep up with this?
This is the point. So then I said, well, how does this actually happen? So there's two crucial ways in which the bureaucracy enable this. Number one is that if they don't, they're supposed to write these letters to the relevant cabinet committee, and they're supposed to respond. If there's no response, it's deemed to be approved. That's the first default that gives them power. The second is the time for sending in a response, 48 hours. So there's just no way that anyone reviews this stuff. Plus, there's a culture of well, if you let my stuff go through, I'll let your stuff go through. So no one ever stops anything.
It's like a broken investment committee, like where both sides just getting whatever they want.
Exactly. So that's actually how all this stuff happens. And then I said, well, where is all this stuff coming from?
Yeah.
What's the origin of all this bureaucratic action and activity? And it turned out that about 70% of it, I said, what proportion of it is necessary for the implementation of what we're supposed to be here to do, the actual program of the coalition government? The answer was 30%. The rest of it was either implementing EU directives or just stuff that the bureaucracy itself had generated. And that's the point where I realized this is totally out of control and unaccountable.
These people are running the country for 70% of it, and they're not even elected. It's crazy.
Exactly, and it's coming from the EU. And again, people would say, well, I mean, let's not get too much into the EU unless you particularly want to, but there's a fiction that the EU has a democratic kind of aspect to it, because you've got the elected European Parliament, and you've got what's called the Council of Ministers, which is the politicians from each of the member states, and they have their meetings and they vote on stuff. But you've got this qualified majority voting system, which is now 20 odd members. So everything is basically passed through, because no one wants to block anything in case their thing is blocked. So all the incentives are for just government and bureaucracy to grow and grow and grow. And so to me, that was an incredibly valuable lesson of how you have to really understand the precise details of the process in order to make any dent in it at all.
You can't fight to fix it unless you actually see what's happening there.
Exactly.
And so you had this experience, and then you had a very top show on Fox for a while. And what was that transition? Why did you do that?
So, funnily enough, it was connected to Brexit, because, as I mentioned, when we moved here, I'd had some conversations, actually enabled and facilitated by someone I'd met in the Obama administration, who happened to be, who I'd worked with on some policy issue, and I remember them saying that they were going back to Stanford to teach. And so I said, well, that's nearby, maybe they can help help me think through what I would do. So I ended up at Stanford for a couple of years, including at the D School at Stanford, which is an amazing
school,
institution where I really learned, in order to teach it, I learned the methodology of innovation, which really has informed so much of the amazing success of the tech sector here in the Bay Area. It was founded by David Kelly, who's the founder of IDEO, which is the kind of original,
cool.
So amazing experience teaching at the D School. And it was during Brexit that I was back in the UK. I think the paperback version of my book, More Human, had come out, in which I came out publicly in favor of Brexit, and I was doing some TV stuff around that. And someone pretty significant was in the UK at the time watching, called Rupert Murdoch. And he just reached out and said, would you like to have a conversation? And we did, got on well. And then a few months after that, after various changes at Fox News, we had another conversation, and he said, I'd like to get you involved, and that's how it started.
Amazing.
So totally unexpected, nothing that I'd planned. I'd never really done any television work before. I mean, a few small things in connection with my book, but never actually hosting a show.
What'd you learn about the media world? Anything surprise you?
Well, what was amazing to me was just the experience of Fox is just an incredible company. Of course, it's got very strong reputation, but for me, it's just been an absolutely wonderful place. A very warm culture, actually, in terms of the. It's a very kind of family. It feels like a family business, which I know people will probably think is.
They weren't trying to knife you or something. It was like people
No,
were
the opposite.
nice.
Incredible freedom, no editorial control at all,
Wow.
or guidance even. It's like
Really? Because it seems like Tucker when he's out is different than Tucker when he was there. Just as one example, like there must have been some control of certain boundaries or something.
No, not at all. I mean, I remember being really shocked by that, actually, in a positive way, and hugely supportive of some very controversial at the time things. Now they're commonplace, but I was the first on TV to lay out all the evidence showing that it was Fauci's experiments that were the origin of the pandemic. I mean, back in when I put that out on television, that was seen as I think it's still online described as a conspiracy theory.
I got my Facebook account throttled at the time for sharing similar suspicions.
Right,
Yeah.
and so, but I did a lot of research. I had a lot of help actually from people here in Silicon Valley who'd really understood that whole process, and total support for that. I was the first to call out the lockdowns. I mean, that was in March 2020. I put Jay Bhattacharya on, and you're right, in the early days when, again, that was a very, very tough thing to say. You were accused of literally killing people.
This is very courageous. So I want to shift to California, but I want to use this as a shift because I think it's very courageous and smart to bring Jay Bhattacharya on. I think his statement that no one wanted to hear was correct. I obviously also posted about what Fauci did to cause that virus. The median California voter does not seem to want this type of courage, like, right, at least from what I've seen. So how is this? How can you run for governor of California if you have a state that doesn't agree with you on a lot of these things?
Well, funnily enough, I think that there's a lot of agreement on the issues. Maybe not on the political way to make it happen. But I mean, the kind of path really towards that was that increasingly, as I was talking about these policy issues, and I tried to focus on my show, and you came on a number of times, and to talk about policy as well as the politics. I tried to really, make that a part of the show. It's called The Next Revolution.
So you think people tend to agree with a lot of the policy if you can take away some of the partisan nonsense?
Certainly here in California. And so the thing that was really, as the years went on, I found myself more and more, probably the right word is frustrated at just talking about the problems and not, given that I had spent time in my past doing things, whether that's developing policy ideas, actually trying to implement them in the government, starting businesses. I think of myself as a doer.
Yeah.
And here I am on TV, literally as a talker, which is like a fun and amazing opportunity, but not really who I am.
You want to go be a policy entrepreneur and a leader and actually
Yes,
fix
exactly.
it.
So I moved towards that. The first kind of foray into that in California was some work to try and do some policy work around our housing crisis, which is the number one reason people are leaving the state. We have the highest housing costs in America, and so on. That led to an attempt at a ballot initiative, which we were a bit late with, didn't raise enough money for. But that really got me going down that path. I started a policy organization, started doing the work on a whole range of different policies called Golden Together was the name of the organization. And then as that went on, I was just thinking, well, again, let's not just talk about it, let's try and do it. And so that brings us to running for governor. And it seems to me when I'm on the road, I mean, I've been on the road the last couple of years, actually.
It's around the state, meeting people too.
Exactly. And businesses and families and communities all across the state, really learning about the issues. And now I'm doing it as a candidate. And I think there's broad agreement about the problems in California, right across the political spectrum, that we are massively over-regulated, the government is too big and bloated and intrusive, and it's crushing the spirit of entrepreneurialism and innovation and all that California represents in its best version, and also making life incredibly expensive. So from small businesses, I hear all the time, it's just such a hassle and a struggle to do anything.
Yeah, if you're rich, it's okay if there's extra rules.
Yeah, but if you're a family, it's like it's so impossible to live, because everything's so expensive.
We have a place here and we're trying to build an ADU because the law makes it really easy, but it turns out there's these extra couple $100,000 of expenses they make us do just to build it.
Yes.
And it's that actually happened to be successful enough. It doesn't matter for me, but I can see an average person, this is insane, right?
It's insane.
just
I mean,
tough.
the costs and remember one of the things back in the day before working in 10 Downing Street and doing all the political stuff, I started companies in the UK. Not with your level of success, Joe, but it was good, and among the businesses that I started were a couple of restaurants, which is an absolutely impossible business.
That's a tough thing.
At the best of times,
Yes.
right? It's really, really tough. And we made it harder for ourselves because we were trying to pioneer something. Actually, Jamie Oliver did a much better job of it, but a bit later on. But we wanted it to be a kind of obviously commercially successful, but also make a social contribution. So we had a job training program for local disadvantaged youth, and we were trying to do the whole, organic, seasonal food, like we put a lot of burdens on ourselves, as it were, in terms of the kind of business it was going to be. But the reason I bring it up is that now here in California, I talk to restaurants. I like doing events in restaurants or bars and meeting the owners, because they are on the receiving end of so much of the nonsense. The labor regulations, the environmental regulations, the cost for...
It feels like you're guilty until proven innocent if you're an employer here right now.
It's unbelievable. I mean, there's this incredible thing in California called PAGA, the Private Attorney General's Act, which is unbelievable. Like, basically, it's 2004 it was introduced, and it's really, like so much in California, the product of corruption, because it's a gold mine for lawyers, and lawyers, along with government unions, are the main funders of Democrat politicians in California. And this thing, PAGA, the Private Attorney General's Act, basically outsources to lawyers the enforcement of California labor law. That's the idea of it, to make sure we don't let anybody get away with it, and we don't have enough. This is the actual. I'm trying to be fair to them in how they conceived of this. Is we're the government. We can't possibly clamp down on every single business in California. We don't have the resources, so we're going to enable any lawyer to do it for us. Private Attorney General's Act, PAGA. Where it ends up is every business in California it's these endless lawsuits. Your lunch break that's supposed to come in after 5 hours, you're supposed to have a certain amount of time. You started 1 minute late, and that's a lawsuit. And then every single week that goes by beyond the filing, it's $100 accruing in fines for each employee, regardless of how much the size of your business. I mean, it's just absolutely enormous. And these settlements, they all settle because
no one wants to be in court for years.
Exactly. The payouts, these are just random numbers. The small Mexican restaurant in Orange County, I was talking to some ludicrous example where they were sued for gender discrimination on the menu, because the section of the menu that was describing egg dishes, I'm not making this up, was called Los Huevos. And the argument was this is discriminatory, it should be non-binary. And
what?
No, I know. And it was going to be les huevos, is what they wanted, which is
French?
not a word. Exactly. It's not a word in Spanish, right? I promise you it's true. And then, so that's a lawsuit. And of course it's nonsense, and it would never kind of go anywhere, but you've got to make it go.
It's just too expensive time and money to deal with it. So that particular
65 grand to make it go away for total nonsense. That's a low settlement. I mean, you got many restaurant owners I meet, they say they factor into their cost of doing business $1 million a year for PAGA lawsuits. It's things like the blue paint used for your disabled parking is the wrong shade of blue.
Wow.
I mean, it's just, the PAGA lawsuits are just unbelievable in terms of their impact. But that's just one of many things.
This is why a lot of people leave and build things other places, but you're not leaving. You're staying here and fighting. So
Yes.
Why stay and fight? Just the weather's nice? Like what's the idea?
It's more than that. I mean, that's of course true, but there's something about California that to me is very, very special. I'm really in love with California. It's not just I love being here. The idea of California, what it represents, to me, it's the best of America. Everything that we admire about America, and I've admired for years from afar about America.
Innovation, immigrant culture,
immigrant, and the sort of startup hustle, but also something that the term I use for it is the rebel spirit. It's this sort of, we're just going to look at the success of all the great geniuses like yourself in Silicon Valley. It's people who've got that kind of, no, it doesn't have to be like this. And that's what's being crushed. That's what I hate about what we've got now.
Yeah, they are crushed. The rebels are a lot of them are leaving because you're too crushed. But some of them are still here, so you can still win. But why did California turn deep blue? Because a lot of people cite that Reagan did an amnesty thing that might have shifted the demographics. Like, what was the real? What in your mind is the reason it turned deep blue?
Well, I think I just wrote a book called Caliphalia, Reversing the Ruin of America's Worst Run State. And at the beginning of the book, I go through the kind of steps to this I mean, we've now had 15 years of one-party rule, total control of state government by the Democrats, and a lot of it is technical, changes. I mean, it did start with. I mean, where I start the story is the granting of collective bargaining rights to government unions, because that started the build-up of this incredibly powerful Democrat.
Reagan messed this up too, right? Actually,
Reagan
interestingly
started
enough.
exactly,
Yeah.
and it was for really for law enforcement. And you could say at the time it was late '60s.
It's a populist thing. These are conservative people,
Exactly.
and give them some. You're helping the working class. So he thought he was doing something good.
Exactly, but then Jerry Brown, in his first term as governor in the mid to late '70s, expanded it, and it went to local government officials, and then suddenly you're in this world where you've got this enormous Democrat political machine, incredibly well funded, because it's paid from taxpayer funded, basically.
Yeah, it's like 2 million plus workers that just give a piece of their paycheck
Yeah.
to. When I think of
The government
California,
unions, by the way, it's $1 billion a year. So $1 billion a year to politics, just from the unions.
And I think I tend to
the
think
government unions.
I tend to think of California as having three parties. You tell me, but my view, there's like the union left, which is getting this $1 billion a year for free. There's like some version of a moderate left, and then there's some version of the right. And I think they're like equal size in California. Is this not right? How should I think of this?
Well, it's interesting. So going back to something you touched on earlier, which is the position on the issues. It's interesting. Last November, so November 2024, there were 4 major ballot initiatives, at least there's a few others, but the big ones, where the Republican position prevailed. So on crime, Prop 36, which undid a lot of the damage of the notorious Prop 47 that Kamala Harris pushed through.
You can steal whatever you want.
Yeah,
basically.
up to $950 per day. Everyone forgets that. It's not just
per day is pretty good. You can make a living off of that.
Exactly, per day. So Prop 36 last year kind of reversed most of that. That passed with 70% in every county. 70% statewide, majorities in every county.
That's good. So we're not insane here in California.
Also, there was a massive tax increase in the form of a pretty corrupt bond measure that was defeated. Rent control expansion was defeated. Minimum wage increase was defeated. So it's interesting. You've seen across and going back a few years, you've had racial preferences in universities and elsewhere defeated in California. There's been examples of the whatever term you want to use, Republican, conservative position winning statewide. And then there are other signs that things are changing. 10 counties flipped from blue to red in November last year.
And this is a very moderate red, right, when in California, because that's like the nature of California. Or how would you describe it?
Well, I don't like that word, actually.
You don't like that word?
Because
What word would you
I
use?
think that what's needed to turn things around on the
bold.
core issues of on the basic governance issues, which is
that.
like the massive nanny state bloated nightmare of a government that we have, crushing everyone's soul and spirit and making it impossible to do anything in California, to build houses, to run a business, to do anything, right? You need to be very aggressive on that, really aggressive. And same with the what's going on in schools. We have this insane ideological experimentation going on in public schools, and the results are a disaster in terms of actual outcomes. We have like less than half of students meet basic state standards in English.
And meanwhile, they're getting rid of in San Francisco and Palo Alto all the honors classes, even now.
Yes, and the insanity just continues. I think but for people who don't follow it closely, there's a sense of, well, we've reached peak insanity in California. They're coming back to their senses. George Gascon in LA was kicked out, and new mayor of San Francisco, who's a friend of mine, and a bit more.
He's doing better. He's doing better.
Right, but the insanity just rolls on. San Francisco schools, they just announced this whole new thing where they're going to have. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the list of things. So when they do grading, they're not going to take account of homework. B grades automatically become A grades. You can get pass with 20%. Just on and on.
It's
and
craziness. It's equity. It's equity. Yeah.
It's just and again, even on the crime issue. So just a few days after we're taping this, there was this massive riot basically in Los Angeles. And a party that got out of control and kind of masked and hooded people marauding around, graffitiing and destroying local businesses. Then they go on the metro and they stop trains, and then they break into the trains and assault people. Not a single arrest, not one.
Let's talk a little bit about public safety. So you mentioned obviously Prop 36 passed by a landslide to take away the $900, free stealing stuff every day. But we also talk a lot about the homeless crisis. I think there was over $24 billion spent on it.
Yes.
Seems to have made it worse. It seems like there's a lot of corruption around this area. Like what should we be doing here?
So it's a massive, massive scandal that this has been going on for so long. I mean, as I like to point out, we're now in the 23rd year of Gavin Newsom's 10-year plan to end homelessness in San Francisco, which has just got worse. And it's his 7th year as governor, and he keeps saying he's going to do something about it. The numbers actually go up and up, and there's another number which is $32 billion.
Wow.
Spent on homelessness. So the components of the problem are these. Number one, it's illegal to camp and live on the streets in most cities in California. We have not enforced the law.
Yeah.
They've hid behind the Ninth Circuit court ruling, which was the Boise ruling.
But we overturned that recently.
Well, I just want to make one very important point. That was total BS, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the actual ruling, the original one, that they said tied their hands, can't clear homeless encampments. What it said was that you can't remove people from the streets unless you have sufficient shelter available locally. It didn't define what shelter was.
Yeah.
It could be, a sort of massive tent that you erect overnight very cheaply, as we saw. We could do cheap and
Give them
available
a place
shelter.
to go, basically. Yeah.
But they defined shelter as what they call permanent supportive housing, which is an apartment unit costing, because of all the other corruption and regulation involved in house building in California, $700,000, $800,000, $1 million now in San Francisco per unit, right?
Crazy.
So that's where the money's gone, if we want to dive down that track. But the reason the problem isn't solved is because in 2016, as well as step one is they haven't been enforcing the law.
Yep.
Step two is they've got this, they passed a law in 2016, the only state in America to do it, implementing in legislation this approach called housing first, which says that you've got to, the number one thing is, and it sounds like a sensible thing, of course, give homeless people housing. But what it means is that you're not allowed, and it's now actually against the law in California, for any organization working with homeless people to require sobriety or drug addiction treatment or any kind of treatment. Now, given that we know that over 80% of people living on the streets have an addiction of some kind and or mental health problems, you're effectively making it illegal to solve the problem. So I've spent a lot of time with organizations working with homeless people right across the state. And the way they describe it to me is like, what we've been doing is giving people second homes, where you basically say, here's an apartment, and you can continue, because there's no requirement of behavior change, continuing to use, sometimes deal drugs from the new apartment you've been given or back on the street.
Well, they're dying in the apartments that we're giving them. It's
exactly.
Crazy. It's
and then the
crazy.
third component, which again is very important to understand the details, is given that mental health is such a massive part of the problem, we don't have sufficient we are woefully inadequate in terms of mental health capacity in California. So you talked to, I was just in Sonoma County just the other week, just random example. The sheriff there was telling me that 50% of the people in his jails have severe mental health problems, right? That's where we're actually treating
We need
them.
some kind of asylum for them, not a jail, right?
Well, here's the problem. So because of the asylum word and the stigma associated with that, remember that most of the people we're talking about in this situation are low income, therefore it's all Medicaid. And as so often in government, you've got to follow the money. So local governments plan provision based on their reimbursements from federal Medicaid for this mental health treatment. When Medicaid was set up in 1965, there was a rule put in place because there was public outcry against insane asylums and all of that, right? That says we don't want these big institutions. So there's a rule called the IMD rule, the Institutions for Mental Disease, which says that states cannot get Medicaid reimbursement for any facility offering mental health care with more than 16 beds. Very precise number, which is tiny. So you end up with these very inefficient outpatient kind of services instead of modern, effective mental health treatment. Now,
you want bigger places to help people.
Exactly. The first Trump administration created a waiver from the IMD rule that states could apply for. Guess what? California hasn't applied for the rule. So we have this combination of factors which mean that the underlying causes of the problem are never solved, and that's why you end up with California right now, where 11% roughly of the US population, nearly 50% of the homeless population.
Is it also just the fact that when you're putting so much money into it and so many groups are making money off it, somehow their incentive is to bring people here and give them more money, right?
Yes, they see the systems, exactly right. And so it's just a classic example of a fundamental values issue going on in California, which is so often on so many areas. You are rewarded for doing the wrong thing, and punished for doing the right thing. You're just trying to run your business, do the right thing, create jobs and opportunity in your community, and you're constantly harassed and punished. Whereas if you break the law, or if you're cheating or trying to get, healthcare that you're not entitled to, whatever it is, there's so many examples where people who are doing the wrong thing actually get rewarded. And so you can't run a society like that.
Let's talk about housing affordability. That's another big issue, I think, for a lot of people here. When I used to live here full time, I had all this staff that had to commute from like an hour away.
Yes.
It seems like a very offensive commute because you're driving by massive amounts of empty land.
Yes.
Which is like
Yes.
kind of obnoxious, and then and I pay them very well. Just like, even you pay people well, like the working class can't afford to buy homes around here. And then at the same time, there's the other side of it. I was with someone earlier, and he's in the neighborhood in Palo Alto, and he's he's a middle class, very talented person. And they want to build a 17-story building right next to his house, which is also kind of scary for him. Like there's these nice 4-story things going, and they are more dense, but all of a sudden they want to do super, super dense, which is kind of scary, I think, to the average person here too. They don't necessarily want to change their communities. Like what's the right solution here? Can we use more land? Can we get rid of the CEQA rules? Like, what are we going to do?
Well, there's so many elements to it. Let me unpack it. The actual simplest way of thinking about the solution is this. Instead of forcing housing into communities that don't want it, let's allow housing to be built in the places that do want it, which is there's a lot of them in California. What's underlying all this is just bad ideas that have all come together in this housing crisis. So a big part of it is the climate ideology. Actually, that's driving a lot of when you actually look at what's going on.
Is this used to say no to new housing in different places?
Well, there's an ideology of infill only development. So they are against, and this has really been the dominant thinking on housing, what they call sprawl.
Yeah.
What they call sprawl, I call the California dream, right?
Yeah.
That's how people want to live in California.
Yeah.
Single family homes, raise your kids so they can enjoy the weather. Now, rich people have that. But the ideologues in charge of California say, fine for our rich donors to have that, but the poor people can't. They must live in apartment buildings in the center of town and take transit and not drive. There's a whole way of thinking about this is how we want to live. And I hear them often say things like, we should be more like Paris or London. Well, we're not Paris or London. It's just anti-human. It's this ideological approach to everything, which I think is really characteristic. Of everything, where they've got a set view of how people should live, rather than enabling people to live the lives they want. They're telling people, you've got to live in line with our ideology. So where does that get you? Number one, they're just massive amounts of regulation to stop single family homes from being built that expand the development footprint. They say we need more density. If you actually look at the numbers, we already have pretty much the highest density in the country. Only about 5% of our land is developed in California.
Lots of open land everywhere.
There's lots of open land, just as you said. If we increased, we did the math in my policy group, if we increased the development footprint of California from 5% to 6%, which would still put us really low in terms of other states, you could have housing for 10 million people in single family homes on quarter-acre lots, which is really big. So there's massive ability to do that, but they don't want it. They put in all these rules. For example, in 2018, the VMT rule stands for vehicle miles traveled. Any development, you have to calculate how many vehicle miles will be traveled. And that, by the way, is an anti-business thing as well. I was talking to a guy who's got an artisan gin business on the Central Coast. Lovely business. He wanted to build a second, doing really well, wanted to expand, build a second still.
Yeah.
Blocked because vehicle miles traveled, it would cause more traffic. Yes, we call that growth. That's what isn't that what we should be all about? Crazy. And all these people go about abundance. Yeah. But the ideology in operation in California has been scarcity. You can't do this, can't do that. So the way that's implemented is through all these different types of regulation. You mentioned CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. That is a big barrier, but not in the way that people think. It's not about the environment. Right now, you've not so much about the environment. You've got over 1 million housing units in California that have been approved by local government, gone through zoning, compliant with CEQA and all the other environmental rules, blocked by lawsuits. Is a little bit like PAGA, going back to that.
So everyone can sue.
Anyone can sue under CEQA. It's called the private right of action. That was granted. It wasn't in the original bill. Everyone says, Reagan signed this in 1970. That's true. But over the years, the courts have granted this private right of action and expanded CEQA to cover housing. 70% of lawsuits under CEQA are used to block housing. Most of them are filed, guess By who?
Neighbors?
The unions.
Unions.
The
Why
unions.
why unions?
Because they use it as leverage in negotiations
force
with
them to use
developers.
union labor.
Yes, so they're called project labor agreements, and they have two components, one or other or both. They call it skilled and trained, a nice euphemism for union-only labor, or prevailing wage, which is when you. I mean, I was talking to a house builder about this. What does that actually look like in practice? Well, is it in the Central Valley, so the rate's a little bit lower than at the coast. So he said, I've got two jobs right now, current projects. One is a market rate. They call it market rate prevailing project labor agreement. The market rate, he had a team of plumbers, $25 to $40 an hour. The exact same people working on the project labor agreement site in the same town, basically, $95 to $120.
And it sounds good to pay people more, but that means the house is going to cost $100,000-$200,000 more.
Exactly. So that's my point. I'm very much, a leader of what I call positive populism. I'm pro-worker. You want workers to be paid, but not at the rate that makes the cost of building a house 4 or 5 times more than in a neighboring state.
You don't want to destroy the economic activity, which is what they've done.
That's what they've done. And so you've got, the insanity of this, for example, on the skilled and trained, which was they needed to have union carpet fitters. There weren't any. And so they had to literally sort of bust them in from the Bay Area and put them up in a hotel. It's just insane. Every single day I'm learning just the stories you hear of the insanity that make it impossible to do anything. A small independent winery in wine country, the owner was telling me this is a typical story. They wanted to expand their visitor numbers, right? They had a patio. Mm-hmm. They had a permit for 30 people maximum. Built an extension. They wanted to increase to 50. It took 6 years and $1 million to do that.
6 years?
Yes, to get the permit. Environmental reviews, consultants. It's all corrupt because the local planning department says you have to use these consultants if you want to get a permit. And of course, these consultants are the ones that they are going to go and work for in 5 years' time. It's just the whole thing.
This property we're on right now in the People's Republic of Woodside, where I live here, I wanted to modify this to be this office we're in now as a barn and modify a couple other things. And in order to get the permission to build and to dig something, they had me dig an 80-foot trench that was it was 14 feet deep and 3 feet wide, and it was with the friends of the town geologist. And once I did that, they gave me the permit right away. Which is like obvious. It's like you kind of know what's going on.
The house construction thing is such a great case study of everything that's going wrong. Like another example, I was just in San Diego with a house builder, apartment builder, starter apartment. Exactly what we want, right? Yeah. Small, nice apartments for first-time buyers. And he said, he refuses to participate in the affordable housing scam, which is what it is. So he's doing it all market rate with no government subsidy or anything. Means he's not subject to all these regulations. So basically, he builds it costs $350,000 per unit to build. The exact same thing if he did a job which was part of the affordable housing scheme, $700,000. Like twice as expensive.
This is what I've noticed is not only the homeless NGOs themselves, but also the affordable housing interest. These seem like very powerful interests. And these are very big donors, obviously, to the party in charge and to the left in California. They're not going to like you. They're going to be against you. So we have to educate people around these things. Yes,
that's why it's really important. So when they talk about another friend of mine, really interesting business he has, building apartment units with what's a really interesting innovation in construction technology, which is mass timber, which is and actually really connects to the whole argument about timber and our overgrown forests. Mm-hmm. It enables less good, perfect samples of, not just a whole beautiful tree, but like offcuts and sort of random bits of timber and wood to be put together and used in a new way. It's mass timber. It's a new construction material of wood, made of wood. And it's very fire resistant, very as strong as concrete, really good. Yeah. But it's shut out of the rules for affordable housing. And so he says, I can build apartments for $250,000 each. The current rate in the Bay Area for affordable is about $1 million. Wow. So that's affordable because there's literally a point system where to get the subsidy from the taxpayer subsidy, so money is coming from whether that's bonds that were issued, I don't know how many years ago, to build affordable housing. So that is taxpayer money that is being handed in a check to developers, and in exchange for the money, they have to meet certain conditions. Use union labor, pay this amount, use concrete. That's a specific requirement.
Interesting. So even though this thing could work just as well. So let's step back a little bit. You have a lot of special interests in California. You have the government unions, which are funding $1 billion towards their interests. You have these other, unions and lawyers like suing people, stopping things, affordable housing groups themselves, who unfortunately, it sounds good, but they're making it expensive. You have the homeless NGOs. What's the best case for California getting its act together? So here's what I worry is that all these policy things, if you could sit down with a rational kind of average person, maybe they might say they're on the left, but if we talk about this, they're going to be like, you know what, Steve, I totally agree with you. This is right. I'm not tied to one of these interests making money.
Yes.
I just want this to be a functional place for my kids. But the problem is that's not how most people's brains work. Most people think, oh, I hate Donald Trump. He's doing you list the bad things he's doing in their minds, and they're offended by him. And you are going to run as a Republican, I believe. And so aren't they just going to be like, oh, I hate Trump, and therefore I'm just going to not listen to you and I'm going to vote against you? How do we overcome that?
Well, first of all, you're right that the stuff that actually in the end is vital to make real change happen, which is a thorough understanding of policy and how you make policy happen.
And boldness to actually stand up to these guys.
So that is, and I agree, I appreciate you saying that, because I think that is a very important characteristic. And it's not just on this issue, on COVID, on the lockdowns, on vaccine mandates, on the origin of the virus, but also on issues like China. I was really first out of the gate on that decades ago, actually, about the dangers of becoming too dependent on China. Even on something as dumb as smartphones, not dumb, but relatively not considered a major policy issue, like smartphones for kids. 10 years ago in my book More Human, I was arguing for that to be restricted. So you have to have that attitude of being prepared to kind of take things on. But you're right that in a campaign, it's not like that. And I've done many campaigns, and I think and that is the job of the campaign. I'm just at the beginning of it, but I think the ingredients of success are there for change in California. So number one, you ask, as we talked about earlier, you've got interesting results on statewide ballot initiatives, a real move towards the Republican Party statewide at the county level, 10 counties flipping from blue to red, including major ones like Fresno, our fifth biggest city. You see individual pockets of change. Huntington Beach, where I launched my campaign, 4 years or so ago, that was a city council run 6-1 by Democrats. Now it's 7-0 Republican. And when they won 7 seats to 0 just now in November, they ran as a slate and they called themselves the Magnificent Seven.
Wow.
So it's really interesting that they were leaning into that.
Well, I guess they saw the Palisades and how much they were destroyed by bad policy.
But I think the biggest thing, there's two really big points in terms of, how can you pull this off? How can you actually win in California? I'm doing this because I know that when I'm the governor, I'll be able to really make a dent on some of these policy areas and start to make life better for families, working families in particular, who've been really hammered by these costs, and small business, I feel very strongly about. I know I can do that. You've got to get elected first. And I think that the two big areas are, first of all, to acknowledge that it's actually much more of a Republican state than people think. The average share of the vote for Republican statewide candidates in the last 20 years, since the last time Republicans won, is 41.7%. So it's not 50%, but it's higher than I think a lot of people assume in California. So call it 40%. You've got to get an extra 10%. Where's that going to come from? I think number one is, actually, Donald Trump got more votes in California last time round, even without particularly campaigning here, than you would need to win in a midterm election. If you just look at numbers of votes. If you look at the data on roughly what you could expect in terms of turnout in 2026, it's about 11.7, 11.8 million votes. It's based on the average of the last two midterms.
Yep.
So to win, you need about 5.9 million. Trump just got 6.1 million. So the Republican votes are there. You just need to get them to turn out. So that is a function of a strong, positive, energetic campaign that says, yeah, it's worth going for it. The second big area is bringing to California the political revolution that's happened across the country, which is these two massive changes: the working class vote shifting from Democrat to Republican, and the Latino vote shifting from Democrat to Republican. In other states, that's been a huge transformation. Obviously in Florida, but Texas as well, Nevada, Arizona, not as much in California. So I think that's our big opportunity. The working class Latino who's been hammered the most by these policies and this assault on everything that they believe in. That upward mobility, the dream of making it in California and climbing the ladder of opportunity, a good job where you make enough to raise your family in a home of your own, in a safe neighborhood, with a good school so your kids have a better life than you. Every single item on that list, I think of it as this ladder of opportunity, every rung on the ladder has been smashed by these Democrats. And it's not that Latino voters are attached to the Democratic Party, it's that they tend not to vote. And so if you look at the numbers in California, about 40% of the state now, Latino, the largest group, but it's only about 24% of the electorate.
Wow.
So if you get that community mobilized in favor of positive, practical things that make their lives better, I really think that we can do this.
Hablas español?
Not enough. I can speak Hungarian. I don't know how much that helps.
That's tough, but I love it. Well, your policies are definitely good for that community. Steve, anything to leave us with? That's on an optimistic note. I really appreciate you being here.
Get involved. Anyone who's watching or listening anywhere, it's going to be hard. I'm not saying this is going to be easy. I say very clearly this is going to be hard, but it's not impossible. And that means we should go for it. And I'm going to need to build a real army, a grassroots army. I want people to get involved. I need money because we're fighting this Democrat industrial complex, this massive machine. So we've got to raise a lot of money. So please help, stevehiltonforgovernor.com, as they say.
Awesome. Well, Steve, thanks for your courage and your leadership, and good luck.
Great to see you. Thank you, Joe.